have an understanding for what is the most important piece to, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be asking about like velocity, right? In order to sequence the body's movements to produce higher pitching velocity. I get that. And so if we're looking at that piece of the puzzle, in my personal opinion, the drive leg loading pattern isn't the most superior. It's not the most important piece that we need to optimize, although it has a lot of things in there that are extremely crucial to all three major goals of the pitching mechanics. But when I look at the pitching mechanics, I see that the ability to segment and increase your separation of the lower body and your upper body is going to be far more superior than anything else in terms of power output. So we just need to make sure that that's the one box that we're checking in terms of, you know, making that we're doing that right, okay? And the one thing that I see in relation to the drive leg loading pattern in regards to separation and segmentation is, if you are somebody that is a quad dominant loader, you need to be conscious that when you load up your quad, your body's direction is essentially going to be dictated by your drive leg. So when you load up your quad, your direction is going to be taken a little bit third base side, and I see this a lot of times, and this is one of the breakdowns of quad dominant loading and heel disconnection, is they have to initiate the rotation of the hips a little bit earlier to catch back up on neutral, which is okay in and of itself. But along with that, since the rotation is initiating a little bit earlier, a lot of individuals will want to then initiate the rotation of the trunk earlier before we anchor down. And that is where we see the biggest disconnect, because we know that the ability to segment and increase the amount of hip shoulder separation, right? Because we know, well, we will find out here later in this ebook that we want to keep the trunk neutral until we anchor down. This is how we create separation, and this is how we create 80% of our velocity. So for the for the quad dominant guys like myself, yes, we want to initiate our hip rotation a little bit earlier because we're going in a little bit skewed direction away from our target. But that doesn't necessarily mean that our trunk is going to be going with our hips. Okay, so we need to make sure that we have the ability to segment hip rotation and upper body delay until we anchor down. Okay, so now let's talk about some compensatory. I hope that's a word. I wrote it down and it sounded right. It's just compensation movements. Again, remember, not all compensations are bad. Some compensations are things that certain movements that the body can do to actually help aid in a lot of really good things throughout the delivery. And these are some of the things we'll talk about positively and negatively. First, we're looking at the quad load, okay? So as I mentioned, we want to make sure that when we're loading up the quad, our hip rotation is actually going to initiate earlier within the sequence comparative to the guys that hip hinge, okay? So when we hip hinge and get into our glutes, now our drive leg direction is going a lot more linear, which is going to allow us to stay connected to the ground for a longer duration of time, probably going to allow the athlete to have a better opportunity to evert the ankle instead of kind of squishing the bug like a quad dominant guy would do. And also going to be delaying that rotation a little bit later if you're a hip hinge guy. So quad dominant guy, you're initiating your rotation earlier, which is also going to complement the notion behind heel disconnection. And when should the heel disconnect? It's going to look differently for guys from the quad dominant space, the hip hinge space, because the quad dominant, as I mentioned, we're initiating our hip rotation earlier, which is going to disconnect our heel. Heel disconnection is occurring when hip internal rotation occurs. Fumblerooski, right? So since our direction is going this way, we have to initiate earlier because we have to gain some ground to catch back up linear. So then our heel disconnection is going to occur a little bit earlier compared to the hip hinge guys, okay? So with quad load, for me personally, I look at it like, how can we set ourselves up for success? And I think a good mechanism to do that is to kind of modify the way that you set up on the rubber. So you'll see a lot of quad dominant loaders will go far glove side. So righties will be far third base, lefties will be far first base, because again, we are going in the opposite direction of, not the opposite direction, but a direction of which is not directly linear. So if I'm a righty and I'm set up far third base side, right? So now I have to do a lot of more compensatory movements to catch back up on linear, and I'm probably going to have a lot of inconsistencies in the slot, because not only am I going far more third base side when I load up my drive leg. So now I'm having to initiate even earlier hip rotation, whereas if you set up far glove side, you can still stay somewhat connected to the ground for a longer duration of time, applying force into the ground. Now, I will say in regards to heel connection and all of that stuff, I'll probably include some content on this. Where I see this as a breakdown with heel disconnection is understanding that when we enter our drive phase, there is a period of that drive phase, and again, these are happening in milliseconds, but we still want to stay connected to the ground. We want to still be continuously applying force as we sink into our hip rotation. And so what that looks like, and hopefully I can do some screenings on this, even if you're a quad dominant guy, that doesn't mean that your direction is so thrown off, right? It's so thrown off that you have to disconnect. So now your force production into the ground is extremely low, and you're leaving a lot of potential power output on the table. And that's kind of in relation to the guys that will set up far arm side, because now they're having to initiate that rotation even earlier than so. Hopefully that makes sense. And then, as I mentioned, make sure that we, as quad dominant loaders, that we have an ability to segment lower and upper. That's the most important piece. Where I screen guys, and you'll see a lot of these breakdown screenings of kids that I've worked with, where I see them as a negative in terms of quad dominant loading is when their quad dominant load takes them in a misdirection, they disconnect early, they initiate their hip rotation, maybe somewhat on time, you know, that's an arguable statement, but what happens as a byproduct of having to initiate that rotation earlier is the trunk then follows before they anchor down. So then you get a lot of guys with quad dominant loads, they don't have any segmentation, okay? They don't have any separation, and that's, as we know, talked about earlier with velocity, that's the piece, right? Like 80% of it comes from the amount of separation you can have. So we want to make sure that we don't mess that one up. So what else? Also with quad loaders, I will say, as far as like a compensation movement that maybe you guys can incorporate, something that I did later in my career was just increasing acceleration, increasing initial move tempo, right? So for me, that has helped with, I mean, just think about it in just like simplistic terms of as far as what produces velocity, force times acceleration. So if we're quad dominant loaders, we're probably not going to produce as much force into the ground as the guys that hip hinge, because now their center mass, their entire body is now into that ground, right? So if you think about like the scale underneath, like the guys that load up the hinge and keep that knee neutral as they descend from peak leg lift, they're probably gonna just weigh a little bit more. So their force is gonna be a little bit higher compared to the quad dominant guys, where you'll see the direction start to take them this way, and the heel will kind of disconnect. So now you're just putting less force into the ground. So think about increasing your acceleration. If that's a move that you just struggle with, you've worked on it, you can't do it, no drill progressions feel good, blah, 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 just increase your acceleration, right? And that brings me to my personal recommendation for guys, because I know there's gonna be a lot of conversation in regards to, hey, what should I do? I'm stuck, I can't figure this thing out, this movement just doesn't work, blah, blah, blah. Because I've been there. My personal recommendation when it comes to the drive leg loading, I believe hip hinging, the hip hinge load is just more superior, right? They produce more force in the ground, they take their direction linear, they have an ability to delay the pelvis from opening earlier, so then they can snap rotation, right? You can have you can have a longer duration if you're a hip hinge guy of building rotational energy as you descend in your drive phase, and then snap it at the last second. All right, it's like pulling a rubber band. You continuously pull, and then at the last second you can snap. Whereas guys that quad load, like I said, we're initiating our rotation a little bit earlier, which again is not necessarily in and of itself a bad thing. It's just what has to happen. So yeah, as I mentioned, my personal recommendation with guys, work towards a hip hinge. Find the progressions, find the throw variations, explore specific feelings of the drive leg. I'll show you some things that I do here in the lab as far as just sensations that I'm trying to kind of replicate in my throw. And if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work, okay? So that's all I got for you. And again, I wanna be clear that it's not that a quad dominant load is bad. It's not that a hip hinge load is freaking superior. It's just that what is occurring as byproducts of the two, okay? So that's one, we want to make sure that we're understanding and we're looking at the big picture of the entire delivery, the entire mechanics of the individual, so then we can assess, like, okay, he loads into his quad, but he still has a really good ability to segment and create a lot of separation and produce power output. Right? Now it's different if he's a quad loader and he delays his hip rotation. Now he has late hip rotation. Now he's not getting separation. And that goes for hip hinge guys too, right? Like you can have a great drive leg loading hip hinge, but like you can still mess up if you don't initiate your rotation on time and you don't create segmentation, or you don't create separation because you don't segment the two parts. Like it's all the same. We're just looking at another piece to this, okay? So hopefully that makes sense, and I'll give you guys some progressions that we can explore the sensations that we're trying to shoot for.